Hi, this is the second installment of my presentation on mental imagery, and last time I defined mental imagery as perceptual processing that is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation in the given sense modality. Now, some of you may not like this concept of mental imagery, or just think that, well, that's just patently not mental imagery, and that's fine. So really what I'm interested in is not some kind of definitional issues of mental imagery. What I'm interested in is the mental phenomenon of perceptual processing that is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation in the given sense modality. If you don't want to call it mental imagery, don't call it mental imagery. Call it mental imagery star, or call it phantom perception. Some empirical people call it phantom perception. What I'm interested in is the underlying mental phenomenon. It's not the label, or how you label it, but the mental phenomenon of perceptual processing that is not triggered by corresponding stimulation. So, and today I want to argue that this is an extremely important mental state because it plays a very important role in our everyday perception. In fact, I want to say something stronger than this. I want to say that it plays a constitutive role in the vast majority of our perceptual states. And the reason for this is amodal completion and multimodal completion. So there are less exciting examples for perceptual processing that are not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation. So filling in the blind spot would be a less interesting example. Peripheral vision would be another example. What I want to talk about is amodal completion. So amodal completion is the representation of occluded parts of perceived objects. So you see a bench behind me. That's exciting. So you see a bench behind me, but do you see all of the bench? No, you don't. You only see this part of the bench and you see this part of the bench. You get sensory stimulation from this side of the bench and that side of the bench. And what your perceptual system is doing is it fills in what's in between. That's called amodal completion. It represents the occluded part of this bench. It's occluded by me. Now, this is a funny example. I didn't know this when I started the recording, but your perceptual system completes this as one bench. But in fact, it's not. It's two chairs. So your perceptual system is fooled, and that happens quite a bit. All right. So there are a number of things I want to say about amodal completion. The first one is that it happens all the time. There are very few perceptual scenarios when there's no amodal completion. Why? Because when we see something, we see a solid three-dimensional object that, by definition, occludes whatever is behind it, unless it's fully transparent. Which happens very rarely, that everything we see is transparent. But even if that's not enough to make you think that this is a really important phenomenon in understanding perception, so far I only talked about occlusion. So there's object A, my hand, occluding object B, which is my face. But there's another phenomenon that is also falls under amodal completion, and that's self-occlusion. So self-occlusion is when the front side of object A, my face, occludes the back side of object A, the same object, the back of my hand. So again, you're not going to get any sensory stimulation from the back of my head in the same way as you're not going to get any sensory stimulation from the part of the bench that's not visible for you. So the question is, how are you going to represent it? And here I want to plug in a huge amount of empirical research that tells us that there is perceptual processing, the earliest kind of perceptual processing there is. So there's already primary visual cortex activation that would correspond to amodal completion. So when you see this bench behind me, your primary visual cortex is drawing a line there, wrongly apparently, because there is no line. But the completion happens that early on. It already happens in the primary visual cortex. So what do we have here? We have perceptual processing, early perceptual processing that is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation in the relevant sense modality. That's exactly mental imagery. So amodal completion, the way amodal completion happens is by means of mental imagery. And if it's also true that amodal completion it was an almost omnipresent feature of perception itself, then that means that mental imagery is an almost omnipresent feature of perception itself. Now I said almost. And the reason for that is that there are, although in everyday perceptual scenes that just happens very rarely, that things are not occluded by something else or by themselves. There are some simple two-dimensional displays, like a two-dimensional display of a triangle, which would be where I don't see any reason to postulate amodal completion processes. So in those cases, there's no amodal completion involved in perception, and as a result, there's no reason to think that mental imagery is involved there. And I made the stronger claim. I made the claim that in the vast majority of perceptual states, mental imagery is constitutive. It's a constitutive feature of perception per se, and that's and the reason for that is because the content of your perceptual state, what you perceive, is fixed not just by your sensory stimulation, but by your amodal completion as well. When you look at this scene, you probably, when you first looked at this, you probably thought that you saw a long bench behind me, but that's just not the case. The reason why you thought that is because your early cortical processes completed that object behind me as a bench. So it's not. So because of this, I want to say that amodal completion, and as a result, mental imagery is constitutive of the vast majority of perceptual states. Good. Now, one thing that needs to be emphasized is that amodal completion can be top-down or bottom-up. Some cases it's bottom-up, and in fact, this was a very good example for an amodal completion that's bottom-up. The reason why you completed this thing behind me as one bench is because the perceptual system follows very simple Gestalt rules to complete simple features in a way that makes the most sense. There's no top-down knowledge involved. But there may be some top-down knowledge involved. So let's suppose that you know me and you know that I have a bald patch at the back of my hand. Then you're going to amodally complete this self-occluding object that is my head in a way that there's a bald patch. If you've seen me and you thought that there's no bald patch, then you're going to complete this in a different way. There's another thing that needs to be emphasized, and that's the role of attention in all this, and also the determinacy or the lack of determinacy in amodal completion. So if I put my hand under my coat, you will amodally complete my hand, but probably you're going to attribute in mental imagery or in amodal completion a very determinable property to where my fingers are. But if your task is to really point out where the tip of my index finger is, then your representation is going to be much more determined. So how you're attending to the amodal completed parts of perceived object is going to be dependent on the exercise of attention. One final thing I want to say, and that's this. So this is a potential objection you may have, is that, wait, Bence, you're cheating. You just defined mental imagery in such a way that it's going to cover amodal completion. You define mental imagery as perceptual processing that is not triggered by corresponding sensory stimulation in the relevant sense modality, and that's just exactly what you need in order to take amodal completion to be mental imagery. But that's just cheating. So I don't think it's cheating. I think that the two obvious other ways of thinking about amodal completion are just false. So if you think that, well, amodal completion does not proceed by mental imagery, it's something else, then two obvious ways of saying what it is would be to say that, well, it's perception, or you can also say that it's some kind of post-perceptual process. So I don't think it's perception, and the reason for that is this. If I do that, if I put my hand under my coat, you're going to amodally complete it, but I want to say that that's just not a perceptual state. You don't have a perceptual state of my index finger. The reason for that is that whatever perception is, and I don't want to give you a definition here for sure, whatever perception is, there's got to be some kind of causal relation being involved. So your perceptual state should be somehow causally sensitive to what's going on in the perceived object. So if you were to perceive the tip of my index finger, then your perceptual state would be sensitive to the movement of my index finger. And I'm moving my index finger, believe me. Nonetheless, your perceptual state is just not sensitive to that. So there's no causal link, so it's unlikely that it's going to be perception. So you're not actually perceiving the tip of my index finger. What I want to say is that you have reason to think that there's very early perceptual processing of my index finger, but that's not perception. That's mental imagery, because that's perceptual processing in the absence of corresponding sensory stimulation. The other thing you may want to say about how you represent my index finger in this case is by means of a post-perceptual mental state, so something like a belief. It doesn't have to be a belief, it can be just some kind of other post-perceptual mental state. And the problem with this is again the empirical findings that shows you that when I do this, then already in the primary visual cortex there's a retinotopic representation of my hand. That sounds like not a post-perceptual mental state, no matter how you're going to cut off perceptual and non-perceptual mental processes. Alright, so I should wrap this up, and I'm looking forward to your comments, and next time I'm going to talk about multimodal completion. We're going to go multimodal. So thanks a lot, and see you next time.